This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, Sampath. India and China have reached an agreement on patrolling arrangements along the line of actual control. This is expected to lead to disengagement and a proper resolution of the tensions that had emerged along the India-China border after the Galwan clash in 2020. External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar has said that this agreement is just the first phase. So, what exactly is covered by this patrolling agreement? What are the outstanding issues that remain to be covered? And what is the significance of the recent meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping in the context of this agreement? We decode the latest development in India China relations in this episode of In Focus. And we have with us Jabin T. Jacob, Associate Professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Shiv Nadar University. Jabin, welcome to In Focus. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sampath, for having me.
So, Jabin, according to media reports, the two sides, India and China, have agreed to restore patrolling rights for each other in two places, the Depsang Plains and the Demchok region. Can you please explain for our listeners what exactly are the terms of this patrolling pact? How many patrolling pacts are there in total? I hear numbers like 65 or so. So, how many of these are covered? And can India's forces, Indian security forces, will they enjoy the same patrolling rights? Can they go up to whatever patrolling point number like XYZ, which they used to do before April 2020? Can they enjoy the same rights, or have things changed even with this agreement?
Okay, so as we understand from information in the open domain right now, the latest agreement, the what the government has called a new patrolling arrangement, will cover Depsang and Demchok only. The government has said, the Foreign Secretary has said that the previous agreements reached following the Galwan clashes will not be reopened, which is to say that the five friction points that cropped up in 2020, in the summer of 2020. Disengagement has taken place from these 5 points, but patrolling hasn't resumed in these areas. So there is something of a buffer zone, as is being called as it's being called, in these 5 areas. The current agreement only covers Depsang and Demchok, which were actually areas in contention well before 2020 as well, though the Chinese did do something also in 2020 in these areas. In terms of number of patrolling points, the 65 that you mentioned is the number of patrolling points from the Karakoram Pass down to Chumar, so from the north to the south. So that's a total number. And if you recall, there was a police conference, a conference of Director Generals of Police, that in which a paper presented reported that out of 65 patrolling points, India had lost access to some 25, 26 odd patrolling points. So, I mean, I suppose this particular agreement will now ensure that India has regained rights to patrolling in the areas of Depsang and Demchok only. So that's the status of affairs. It does not touch disengagement process in the previous five friction points post 2020.
Like, which are the other? So, what remains as outstanding issues in terms of resolution for patrolling rights? What are the other three friction points that we are still? Are we still talking about them, or are they going to be initiating negotiations on those at some later date? Is there any timeline?
So actually, if you go by what the foreign secretary has said, he stated that after disengagement, the next step is de-escalation and then the induction of troops. So, from the statement that has been made from the government, it would appear that now that we have disengaged or patrolling is going to be resumed in Depsang and Demchok, the next steps would be of de-escalation and de-induction, but this is going to be at an appropriate time. So there is no reference really to whether or not patrolling arrangements will be resumed in the previous friction points, which is the 2020 friction points, Galwan, Hot Springs, Gogra, and so on. Now, logically speaking, I would imagine that the next step would actually be resuming patrolling in these areas as well. and then only can de-escalation and de-induction happen.
So it's not possible that you do de-escalation and de-induction only in these two, Depsang and Demchok, and then rest remains as it is. That's not logical, right? Or it's not possible.
Well, that really depends on the negotiators and the sort of trust level between the two sides. I mean, anything's possible, but I don't foresee that happening as you described it.
Right. Yeah. Because how do you do de-induction if you are not going to be able to do your usual patrolling? I just don't
No, I
understand that.
mean, we've always done patrolling without this level of troops on either side. I mean, the situation escalated. The 50,000 troops were moved into both, I mean, on each side post, the clashes in 2020. So patrolling was always happening, and of course the problem was that patrols would run into each other, and then over time, I mean, there is a laid down protocol as to what patrols are supposed to do when they run into each other. But before 2020, and I suppose particularly in the wake of Doklam and so on, I think troops were running into each other, and then fisticuffs and actual confrontation, physical confrontation was happening, and that is what has been a problem. And possibly it is possible that this new arrangement will also, I mean, will actually take care of that. In fact, it has been talked about that now the two sides will engage in coordinated patrols, which is that they will inform each other before such patrolling, any patrolling is carried out. Now, coordinated patrols have their pros and cons. I suppose the pro is that, well, troops are well informed and ordered well in advance that there is not to be any fighting and fisticuffs. But then the con is it reduces the sort of military objective. I mean, this is more performative than actually a militarily useful exercise.
Yeah, but isn't patrolling basically about performativeness? How is any military objective achieved? You're just reiterating, okay, your claim line is till this point. That's performative, right? What is the military objective here?
No, no. I mean, it is there is a military objective in that troops are able to do it. I mean, each side's troops are able to do it on their own time and their own initiative, as and to check and to monitor activities on the other side, right? So that's the objective. Plus, of course, I mean, it's not a small thing that we actually go and touch our claim lines or ensure that our claim lines are understood clearly. So that objective, that military objective, is of course there. But the more this is coordinated and controlled and taken out of the initiative of local troops, then I suppose it becomes performative. I mean, really, these things are a matter of perspective, I suppose. I mean, it is the troops on the ground, the commanders on the ground, who are in the best position to evaluate how this patrolling arrangement is going to work out. And right now, our understanding is that, well, today, that there was a deadline given to dismantle infrastructure or temporary infrastructure on both sides. But given the altitude and given the weather, this might not necessarily happen in time. So we'll only be able to assess the situation probably in the summer of next year.
Okay, okay, but there were reports saying that I mean immediately in the 9 or 10 days following this agreement, there are like changes happening on the ground itself. In terms of
Sure, but we don't know the exact scope or scale of these changes. Some temporary infrastructure has been removed, but is that enough? Is that good enough for both sides? But there's also other more permanent infrastructure that has been built up in these areas. So all of these things will need to be monitored and checked, and we'll have to keep a watch on this.
right. So following this agreement and the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping, when there were readouts of this agreement from the Indian and Chinese sides. I mean, I'm sure they were not identical. So, like, what are your thoughts on any differences you may have noticed in the readouts from the two sides on the agreement?
See, well, first and foremost, there has not been a joint statement or at least a clear statement on the exact patrolling arrangements on both sides. The statements that have come from the foreign ministries, and these are, as you said, quite different from each other. And I think what I'd like to point out is that the foreign secretary is on record to a parliamentary committee saying that a joint statement or a state on these in these cases is not necessarily the practice.
But is that historically borne out? Is that historically accurate? Joint statements are not the practice in these kinds of situations?
Well, firstly, these kind of situations are also pretty unique. So, in that sense, I suppose the foreign secretary is right. But the problem is really that once again, we are going back to a situation where each side can interpret, these statements as they wish or as they see convenient. I mean, it is hard enough to pin the Chinese down when they are not. I mean, even after we have a written signed agreement on both sides, I mean, the Chinese essentially tore up all the border agreements and protocols of the last 20 years, in 2020 or 20 years and more, in fact, in 2020. So now, when we actually do not have a common statement on both sides, I mean, there is apparently a statement that an agreement that the two corps commanders are supposed to have signed, but we don't know what the content is. And let's assume that the two sides will actually follow it. If that is the case, well and good. But essentially, the lack of information in the public domain means that we are not, I mean, those of us outside of government or outside of this small group that is dealing with this issue are not in a position to understand or assess, if either side is meeting its obligations, or if things are not going to get worse. I mean, we should also be in a position to anticipate Chinese steps, Chinese moves, and that might not necessarily happen given the lack of transparency around the current process.
Right. So this, I mean, having with all these caveats and ambiguities, there's scope for each side interpreting it the way that is convenient for them. All that being said, I mean, the fact of this agreement is something I would assume it's better than not having it at all in the first place. So in that context, what has actually changed for this agreement to come about? Was it some kind of pressure from the business communities in India or maybe China that we shouldn't let this border dispute hold back from larger domains of cooperation and mutual benefit, say in trade and investments and so on? Is that part of a larger process? Like, what changed from Galwan Valley 2020 to now for this agreement to come about?
So, I want to remind everyone that the Chinese have always been saying that, this particular issue on the boundary should not affect other parts of the relationship. So, in that sense, we are at where the Chinese have always been wanting us to be, which is that we have now set aside or we have reached an agreement on the I mean, we have, as the foreign secretary and the foreign minister have pointed out, completed the disengagement process, and now we are, going to be focusing on other parts of the relationship. So I'd imagine that the other parts of the relationship will include the economic relationship. However, that is not it is not still status quo ante as we originally wanted it, which is that status quo ante would involve not just disengagement but also de-escalation and the induction of troops. So that is not yet the case. But to answer your question about what has changed, look, and it's not just on the Indian side but also on the Chinese side. The international situation, the context has changed, right? The Indian economy and the Chinese economy both are not doing too well, and both I think realize that some degree of engagement and opening up is necessary in order to achieve our larger interests. I mean, the overall India-China relationship is, as a point of fact, much larger than the boundary dispute. And again, each country has to look at larger national interests rather than just their bilateral relationship. So, I mean, there's no doubt that the business community in India has lobbied for opening up and so on, because, I mean, look, we also have objectives such as increasing the share of renewables in our economy and so on. But none of those things are going to happen if we do not engage in some form or fashion with the Chinese. The Chinese control the supply chains in many critical minerals required for this shift in our economy, and they are the technology leaders or market leaders in many of the products that we want in order to achieve the shift. So, I suppose then that means that we'll have to compromise in some form or fashion. Overall, I would say that at least we've held very strongly to this position of disengagement. And if the government says disengagement has happened, well, as in whichever fashion that the government defines disengagement, well, then I suppose that's a step forward. From the Chinese point of view, they are under pressure economically. Of course, their economy is in a really bad way. I mean, they are under pressure from the Americans, and now also from a geopolitical point of view, their position of support for the Russians is also costing them. So they also don't want it to be the case that they are dependent only on the Russians or only have the Russians for their friends.
No, their support for the Russians is costing them how? Because do you mean in terms of sanctions from the US or any kind of changes of policy from the US? Because their US-China relations had already soured to a great extent before Russia invaded Ukraine, right?
Sure, but it's not now. It's not just the U.S.-China relationship, but also U.S.-China-Europe, for example. And also, what signals the rest of China's neighborhood will take from China's support for the Russian invasion of a smaller country. I mean, these have implications for a lot of China's smaller neighbors, for Taiwan. So, I think taken all of that into account, there is a greater degree of wariness, political wariness vis-a-vis China from the rest of the world, and that's a position that, in a time of economic difficulty, in the time when the Chinese will want to obviate, I mean, to sort of ameliorate in some form or fashion.
Right. I mean, there is. I mean, I would like to sort of push you a little bit more on this, but maybe we'll come back to it later. I mean, I was just going to ask you. I mean, there are like two views on this. One is, of course, that in terms of this changing international situation or context, there is a particular stream of thought which argues that, especially, but not specifically with regard to Ukraine and Russia's invasion, but more in terms of Gaza and Israel. It is a US-led pole which is sort of getting isolated, and with BRICS coming in a big way. It is sort of, some people are using terms like the new Bretton Woods and so on and so forth. So is there some kind of an equivalence in terms of China's position and the West sort of being isolated vis-a-vis the global South and the rest of the world, which sort of sees the Gaza conflict differently? I mean, you want to sort of quick thought on that?
Yeah, look, I think the situation is slightly different here. I mean, in practical terms, China is very strongly affected if the US or Europe start imposing technology sanctions, start imposing restrictions on Chinese FDI, because the returns to Chinese investment and the requirements for the Chinese market for high tech from these markets is much, much more important than any purpose that is served with support from the global South, say, for China's or opposition from the global South to the United States in the Israel-Gaza conflict. I mean, China. How is China gaining from the Israel-Gaza conflict either? I mean, it makes all these. It has a lot of posturing, but nobody believes that China is an honest broker in either the Russia-Ukraine conflict or in the Israel-Gaza conflict. It's very clear that the Chinese are taking a position that is very anti-America, and primarily that is the principal concern for the Chinese. That is to take an anti-US position. So I don't think anybody is sort of fooled or misled by the Chinese posture here. So that is what I would say is the difference between the Russia Ukraine and the Israel Gaza conflict. About BRICS, again, you have to remember that a lot of the members of the BRICS, that the new additions are all friends or allies of the United States. Frankly, the BRICS has, I mean, there is nothing that holds the BRICS together. It is a very unwieldy sort of, even when it was just BRICS, there was no organizing principle. And now it's just become a little more disorganized, in my view. It is no substitute for the global South. It is no substitute for the non-alignment movement. It is a China-led initiative, and that by itself, that is the principal problem with BRICS. That it is not an equal partnership or a coming together of countries. That it is dominated by one country, and that I think doesn't take us anywhere. I mean, it's just talk as of now. It doesn't have a secretariat. It doesn't have a structure. So that's not good enough for China to achieve its goals.
Right, it's not an equal partnership, no doubt about that. Anyway, we'll hopefully talk about BRICS on another separate podcast at some particular time if it comes to that. Now, coming back to the India-China issue, Jabin. I mean, I have a very basic question. This entire system of patrolling. I mean, is it not? I mean, I know that the other friction points are still within this framework of buffer zones, and which I understand is not very favorable to India given our claim lines and so on. But why can't we just agree on buffer zones that are, let us say, equitably drawn, stretching from, say, one country's territory, then across the LAC to the other country's territory, where you then avoid the 2020 kind of clashes, because the buffer zones will ensure that you don't have to actually physically go to a particular claim line point or call it patrolling point or whatever in order to sort of reiterate it. Wouldn't the drawing of this or maybe modification of existing buffer zones through negotiations serve that purpose?
Look, I think first and foremost, we have to remember that this is all Indian territory, right? Claimed Indian territory. So when 62 happened, the Chinese were already sort of coming in and sitting on Indian territory. So when you say now already the LAC is disputed, the line of actual control itself, there are two different perceptions of the line of actual control between the two countries. And now what the Chinese have done is again push forward that claim line. So when we say that we are going to accept a buffer zone, essentially we are again walking back further from our claim line. So I think there is a question of, I mean, it is not equitable, first and foremost. It is a question of fairness. So, in effect, what we would do then is to reward China for its bad behavior, right? I mean, we had clear agreements, protocols in place that allowed all of these patrolling and so on to go on, which the Chinese violated, right? So one has to also take into account, you know, the impact it has in terms of encouraging further Chinese bad behavior. So those are the considerations at point. I mean, it's not simply about the buffer zone per se. Yes, you are right. We can always, and eventually the boundary dispute will have to be settled on considerations of what is mutually, what each side can hold conveniently without too much trouble. But as of now, when the question is in dispute, we should not be encouraging bad behavior or just letting them get away with whatever they have achieved in terms of territory and so on and so forth.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. Of course, absolutely. There's no question of rewarding bad behavior, as you put it. And I think it's a long road back to, the way things were. No, I mean, coming to this particular aspect of the way things were, my last question to you, Jabin. What are the chances really of India getting back to status quo ante in terms of how it was before May 2020, say in March 2020? I mean, we not only about patrolling, but also grazing rights of the local tribal communities in different areas in along the LOC, LAC, sorry. So the northern bank of Pangong So Lake, Gogra Hot Springs, Galwan Valley. So is there any real possibility in whatever timeline one might imagine of India getting status quo ante in terms of how things were in March 2020? Because that's also what I think politically significant also for the ruling party and the opposition. That is the main question. Are we going to get status quo ante or not? And does that figure at all in our current talks, or is that like a very much in the distant future?
Look, I think status quo ante. I mean, it's sort of good to keep that as a broad benchmark, but I would say we'd have to be. We also have to take into account, how the local dynamic, the regional dynamic, the international dynamic changes, and maybe we can ask for more. We can press them for, greater concessions, and sometimes it works the other way around. I mean, depending on how we have prepared, how what the global situation is like. So it's never a fixed concept in that sense. I mean, status quo ante, yes, it's fixed in the sense that we know what exactly was the status before April of 2020. But I mean, there's also the consideration that and as we, I think, in the latest patrolling agreement, we have not just stuck to the western sector. We've also, there are reports emerging that we have also talked about restore. I mean, stopping or not blocking Chinese patrols in the eastern sector.
The eastern sector, you mean all the Tawang and those
Arunachal
places?
side. Yes, yes, that's right.
Okay.
So, there's always, over time, the longer negotiations carry on, the more issues will come into play. So, I think that is the way it is. Now, in terms of grazing rights, frankly, one of the achievements of this particular petroleum agreement seems to be that, as the foreign secretary mentions, that grazing rights would be restored in Depsang. I mean, according to this particular agreement, in Demchok and so on. So, but I mean, we'll have to see because it's not just here in these areas that the grazing rights were an issue, but it is in these other areas as well. So, yeah, like I said, we will not. I mean, it's winter. We will not know much at this particular point in time. We'll get more information from the local communities, perhaps only in the summer of next year.
Right, we'll have to wait till the summer, and in the meantime, I think it will be good to have these talks and negotiations going. I think it is in the interest of both countries to pursue the line of disengagement and at the same time also expand other areas of cooperation beyond the border dispute. We spoke about the economic situation where neither country is doing particularly great. The international situation also, I think, is changing, not necessarily in the favor of either country. Thank you so much, Jabin, for coming on board, sharing your thoughts and insights on this latest turn, if one may call it that, in Indo-China relations. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Sampath. Been a pleasure.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.